quick announcement on the Wirewheel side. We're very excited to announce that we've just launched our new universal preference and consent platform. It's now generally available. And our new platform is really addressing those critical needs, specifically around some of the new laws in the United States and globally. And we're really, looking forward to working with companies, helping really solve for some of the new requirements around the country, especially around the Sephora enforcement decision in California.
And welcome everybody. I'm super excited to have a great panel with me today to talk about kind of what the IAB has been up to with both the MSPA and the global privacy platform or protocol. And I've got Sandeep Kapoor with me from ORIC, and I've got Rowena Lamb from IAB, and I've got Wirewheel's own Jeff De Rosalia, and I'm gonna let them all introduce themselves. Sandeep, do you want to say hello?
Yes. Hey, thank you, Sheridan. I'm Sandeep. I'm an attorney at ORIC's privacy practice, and I had a large involvement in the drafting and advising on the MSPA.
Perfect. Rowena?
Hi, everybody. I'm Rowena Lamb, and I'm with the IAB Tech Lab. I'm the Senior Director of Product at Tech Lab, looking after all of our privacy technology initiatives, so including the global privacy platform.
And Jeff?
Hi, I'm Jeff De Rosalia. I'm the head of engineering here at Wirewheel, getting to consume the great work of Rowena and Sandeep, and getting to implement the new protocols here at Wirewheel.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. So I think we wanted to just go ahead and dive right on in. I think we wanted to start with the MSPA and just kind of get a sense of what that is and how it's affecting the industry. Sandeep, do you want to kick us off there?
Yes, absolutely. So initially, the IAB had released a framework or contract that was called the LSPA, the Limited Service Provider Agreement. It was just for California, and it was a way to have signals and contractual provisions interact dynamically. So, Tech Lab created the U.S. privacy string, and basically the way it worked was, if you're a publisher, let's say, and a consumer opted out on your page through a consent preference center or what have you, the publisher can send a signal to downstream participants, like downstream ad tech companies, let's say, to say, hey, this person's opted out. Act as our service provider, which had certain limitations on how the downstream participants could use the data. They could use the data for targeting at the time, but couldn't ingest that data for optimization purposes and stuff like that, and profiles. So it's a way to avoid dropping traffic, but also respect the boundaries of what a service provider can do. The MSPA, Multi-State Privacy Agreement, is basically the LSPA on steroids. It's actually, I would say, essentially completely different. Not only does it cover CPRA requirements, but also all the requirements under all the other 4 state laws that I'm sure we're all grappling with at the end of this year. So very similar. Under California, there are different modes that you can pick, and essentially the way it works is you can send signals out either on a state-by-state basis, depending on how your opt-out setup is configured, and there are certain limitations. So if the user's opted out of sales but not shares, there's certain things you can do, or if you've lumped them all together, there's a standard set of things that downstream participants can do. And another big part of it is under CPRA, for example, you need to have contracts in place with third parties and all your service providers. Really hard to do when, let's say, you have an impression loading on your page, because there's pixels of, say, a measurement company in that impression, and the publisher, by and large, does not have a contract with those measurement companies. But the MSPA accounts for that. They're called gap transactions, and it creates that contractual privity that you need for either a sale or share as a third party, or contractual requirements needed for processors / service providers. That's a very high level overview of the agreement.
Perfect. And I know we'll talk about it more in detail. Rowena, do you want to talk about how the MSPA, what the GPP is and maybe how it relates to the MSPA?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And what I'm actually going to do is share a couple of slides to give everybody participating today just a primer on what the GPP is. Can we just confirm that you guys can see the slideshow?
Yeah,
Perfect.
it's up.
Thank you. So Global Privacy Platform, we'll just do a brief overview of what it is, and then I'll actually talk more specifically about the US state signals that support the MSPA, how it works within the Global Privacy Platform, and then we'll actually take a look at an example of what one of those US state signals look like. So hopefully that helps put everything in context and sort of the rest of the conversation in context a little bit. So the Global Privacy Platform, or the GPP for short, that was a multi-year project delivered by the IAB Tech Lab's Global Privacy Working Group. And it included participation from folks across the industry. And what it is an adaptable channel agnostic protocol for signaling user privacy consent and consumer choice from sites and apps to ad tech providers. And the reason why it's called the Global Privacy Platform is because the idea is that it can pass those privacy signals for any jurisdiction. And it's channel agnostic because we've specifically considered multiple channels in the design of the GPP. So it is ready to support web, mobile, and CTV contexts. The GPP supports existing signals, including IAB Europe's TCF, which is the widely adopted consumer choice signal used for GDPR. And then this last point is I like to highlight because it is an important one. The GPP has a flexible architecture, so it makes it ready to support new regional signals without the need to start from scratch each time. And this flexibility also allows each region signal to be modified independently. So it's totally policy agnostic. Local markets can make policy decisions. And what the GPP is doing is it's providing a standard way to create and communicate the resulting required signals through the supply chain. And this built-in, again, I'm just highlighting this flexibility. This built-in flexibility is one of the big reasons as to why the market needed the GPP. Without it, you can imagine that each time we needed to support user privacy and consent signaling for a new jurisdiction, we would need to define and build a new way to communicate that information. And we sort of saw the writing on the wall a little bit after we worked on IAB Europe, after we worked with IAB Europe on the development of the TCF signal, which was introduced to help the industry comply with GDPR, and then with the IAB on the development of the US privacy signal, which was introduced to help comply with CCPA. And just after doing that work and developing these two distinct signaling mechanisms, it was pretty clear that we were going to need to find a way to streamline this and do this much more efficiently as an industry.
Hey, Rowena, just a quick question. I think just the concept of privacy signaling in general might be a little confusing to folks. Can you give maybe a few seconds on like what that is and what you're trying to achieve?
Yes, I actually have an upcoming slide.
Okay,
that gets into it more. Yeah.
No worries, keep going.
We're going there. We're going there. I'm right there with you. But before, it's actually the very next slide, but before we talk about privacy signaling in more general terms, I also wanted to highlight, what the Global Privacy Platform is not. So when someone hears Global Privacy Platform, I think they think, okay, well, is this a global privacy policy that we're trying to push? And the answer to that is no, it is not a global privacy policy. And the GPP itself is not a policy at all. Another reaction when someone hears just Global Privacy Platform is sometimes, they think like, is this some sort of like consumer portal that's being introduced? And so to just be super clear, the GPP is not, the GPP is not like a one size fits all portal. It's not a user preference center or anything like that. And so let's talk about the signaling and what it is. And so this, I think visualizations typically help. And so this is a visualization of the privacy signaling concept that the GPP is built on. So in its simplest terms, it's the ability to transmit a string end to end in the supply chain. And what that string is it houses information about consumers' preferences, and then they're transmitted using common machine readable interfaces, either on the page, an app, server side. And this allows publishers and CMPs to communicate the consumer preferences with SSPs, for example, who can then communicate with DSPs and so on and so forth, all throughout the supply chain. So when you hear privacy signal, it's really this string of information about the consumer's preferences that we're talking about. So I want to dive a little bit deeper and take a little bit of a closer look at the string that I just mentioned. And this is not real code, but it's pseudocode, I guess, but sort of showcases the general concept of the GPP string. So I mentioned there's information stored in this string, and we separate this information into different sections. The very first section of the GPP string is the header, and we can think of the header as a sort of table of contents for the entire GPP string. So it tells you essentially what's in the string, like which regions privacy signals are available in the string and their position. And then all sections that follow the header section are all distinct privacy signals for a particular region. So in the context of the new US state signals, for example, they would be represented as a distinct section in the GPP string. So the section 1 encoded values and section 5 encoded values that you see on the screen. And then the GPP also includes standard mechanisms to then transport that string. So anybody who has on-page access, they can call the consent management API to get the GPP string. And this API is made available by CMPs or first parties and allows others in the ecosystem to then get that relevant GPP data. And the GPP CMP API specification is really meant to create just a singular API that can be used across to access consent information for any supported privacy signal. And what this means for the industry is that, again, we won't have to continuously build to different APIs with repetitive functions as new privacy strings are developed. And then for those who participate in OpenRTB, there's a defined field in the regs object for passing the string. And similar to the CMP API, the idea here is that we don't need to continue to create and do the same work over and over again and create extensions in OpenRTB in order to pass a new jurisdiction's privacy string. And then for anybody who is downstream who cannot process JavaScript, we have defined URL parameters and macros. And very similar to OpenRTB, the idea here is that we won't need to define new parameters and macros each time we need to pass another string. So this is definitely an oversimplification of the GPP, but what I think are sort of the key takeaways for understanding it at just a very, very high level. So the GPP streamlines technical privacy signaling, and it can be thought of having sort of two primary components. The first is that GPP string, which provides the flexible architecture, including standard data types and encoding mechanisms for privacy signals to be created. And the second are standard transport mechanisms by way of the CMP API, the standard OpenRTB fields, and standard URL parameters and macros. So now that we have like a general understanding of what the GPP is, it's not used solely to support the MSPA. I think we can dive in and get an understanding of, well, how does this relate to the MSPA? So since the GPP is a consent signaling protocol, what it does is using it allows participants to communicate and then honor those consumer choices. So using the GPP would allow first parties to pass the appropriate signals that communicate consumer choices to the downstream participants, providing them with information like what mode the first party is operating in, whether the downstream participant should be engaging as a service provider. And it enables downstream participants to then receive signals to understand and honor the consumer choices. And the GPP does include support for privacy signals for all of the 5 states, as well as the national approach, which I know we'll get into more detail about in a bit. And so I just wanted to show an example too of what one of these state privacy strings looks like. And what I'll do is a quick walkthrough of the process of creating one of these strings. It's only 3 steps, so not going to take too long. So if we take a look at this example, we're looking at what a GPP string that contains a California signal looks like. And so the very first step in creating a GPP string is to create the discrete section for California. So if we take a look at the conditions outlined here, we can imagine that the first party business is an MSPA signatory and has determined that this is an MSPA covered transaction, and they are operating in MSPA opt-out option mode. The consumer was shown the appropriate notice on their digital property as outlined in the MSPA. The consumer did not opt out of sale or share of personal information. The business is not using consumers' personal information for advertising purposes that are unrelated for which the data was collected or processed, and no GPC signal was detected. So all of this information is coded, and you can sort of see that in the upper right portion where we have the fields listed, and I won't go through them. But after that, we then create a bit representation of that. And lastly, we base 64 encode that bit representation to get the encoded section for California or the California string. And so that bottom right, you can see the encoded section for California.
Hey, Rowena, you mentioned the GPC in there, and some of our folks may not be familiar with that. Do you want to just give 2 seconds on what that is?
Yeah, so the GPC is global privacy control. It is a browser level signal that is available that, and maybe Sandeep can probably speak to this in a little bit more detail in terms of like what the legal requirements are, but they do need to be read and honored.
All right, so essentially GPC is based off a specification, which you can find online. And when the idea is that it has to very clearly state that this user is opting out of sales or shares or whatever the GPC happens to cover. Right now, it's mainly opt-outs that are pixel, like opt out of, technologies like use of pixels on websites rather than, let's say you have an email-based opt-out. GPC isn't really designed to transmit that email or show, like, unless you have a way to connect the two, it's going to be hard to use GPC for that. So it's mainly in use of advertising technologies, and it's essentially a signal through like a browser extension, let's say, and it tells the publisher or whatever digital property you happen to be on, this user is opted out of sales or opted out of sales and shares, whatever the extension covers. And it's basically the equivalent of somebody going onto your webpage, clicking on the Your Privacy Choices link, which seems to be the term that most people are favoring, and then clicking off the toggle for pixels that are dropping cookies on your browser or sending information to downstream participants. GPC basically is like an automatic way of pushing that toggle without them actually having to click on Your Privacy Choices and then clicking on the toggle. That's essentially what GPC is. It's a current requirement under the CCPA, and per the draft regulations, is also continuing to be a requirement that has to be honored under the CPRA.
Yep, and it's one of the big things that Sephora got into trouble for with the recent settlement. So certainly top of mind for everybody who's trying to solve for Sephora and get ready for Gen 1 CPRA. So thanks. Sorry, guys. I just want to make sure everyone was up to speed on what that was.
No, that's great. And that's the reason why the GPP allows for the passing of that signal, right? It's because it is a requirement. We're almost through, I promise. And hopefully the ending result will be an aha moment for everybody. So the second step in the process of creating a GPP string is to create the header section. And just as a reminder, the header in the GPP acts as a table of contents for the GPP string. So we follow the same process as we just went through in creating the discrete section, but the data that we're encoding for in this case is that this particular GPP string contains signals for California. And then this very, very last step is to concatenate the header and the California section using a tilde delimiter. And the result is the GPP string that you see in the bottom right. And so now this GPP string that you see includes all of the information needed. The contents of the GPP string, in this case, in our example, it's the privacy string for California, and then the actual California string itself, which contains all of the data about the mode the first party is operating in, the consumer's preferences, and whether a GPC signal was detected. And so now that we have this GPP string, this can be passed and retrieved using one of those defined transport mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. And downstream participants receiving the string can now understand and honor those consumer choices. And so hopefully seeing that actual string and some of the data that the GPP string can communicate was a helpful primer for the rest of this conversation. And for more details on the GPP and each state's privacy string, you can actually check out the specifications on GitHub.
Thanks, Rowena. So here at Wirewheel, Jeff and I have been trying to get the GPP built in as quickly as we can to our new program or our new platform, the Universal Preference and Consent platform. And I think we've done a great job at trying to make it easy for our clients trying to implement it, right? And I think when a lot of clients see something like the GPP and they see complex flows and long strings that they need to develop and all that sort of stuff, we are baking it directly into the platform. So as people are building out the types of consents that they are going to be gathering for their consumers, they'll be able to define a particular consent, and they'll be able to say this consent attaches to this particular section of the string, right? And they'll be able to just like connect the dots, basically. I wish we had a version of that up to show you today, but unfortunately I can't at the moment. But it's really pretty simple, and it makes it really easy. So that way, every time a visitor comes in, they record their consents, you're able to then just automatically take that string, package it up, and send it out, and we'll build that all into the platform. Jeff, anything you wanted to add there?
Just that I think that as we move forward, it's going to be really important that we also that every CMP product on the market has to support a GPP. That you're not viable if you're not supporting the GPP. And so here at Wirewheel, it's a huge priority, and we're going to make sure it's a first class part of the product in Q1 of this year.
Absolutely. So I think it might be helpful, Rowena, do you want to talk through what all the signals are inside of the GPP?
Yeah, so again, it's the global privacy platform, right? And so we are supporting the state level signals for each of the 5 US states that have privacy laws going into effect next year. We are supporting the US national signal, which supports the US national approach in the MSPA, which I know we're going to get into later. But it also has a support for IAB Europe's TCF, which again helps with compliance with GDPR. And it also includes support for IAB Canada's TCF for the Canadian market. And that's actually a new signal. And we actually just launched that new signal in November of this year. So currently 8 signals that are supported in the GPP and some that are not just specific to US states.
Perfect. Sandeep, do you want to talk about what the national approach means and how that kind of plays into all the different signals that are out there?
Right, yeah. So the national approach, I think, is going to be palatable to a lot of signatories or people considering the MSPA. It all depends on how your opt-out regime, in some cases opt-in, is set up on your digital property, let's say. So let's just take a website. That's your digital property in this case. It might be the case that, you know, so not to get too into the weeds, but maybe this is the place to do it. Under the non-California laws, if there is an opt-out of sale, there's still a mechanism by which that you could, you know, do targeted advertising if they haven't opted out of targeted advertising. If you have those as 2 separate functions, right? Or alternatively, let's say, you know, you kind of bucket everything together. You know, this is how you opt out of sales / shares and targeted advertising, right? Someone clicks on it. You might be able to geolocate that user on the back end and say, oh, this person's from Colorado, and for people in Colorado, you know, we'll send the Colorado string out, and, you know, there may be something that we can, some, you know, extra things that we may be able to do. I don't think that's true if they've opted out of all 3, but essentially that's how it works, right? If you may take the position that you have different opt-outs, like a sale opt-out, a share opt-out, /share /target advertising, and then you'll geolocate the user on the back end because the rights are different. There is another approach, which is the national approach. And the national approach aligns with, you know, what I've seen many companies do, which is just, you know, let's just have one opt-out or a couple opt-out, and we're just going to treat everyone the same. So we're just going to subscribe to whatever is the strictest outcome provided under applicable state law, right? So, for example, under the CPRA, I mean, legal interpretations of this differ. I'm just going to give one interpretation. If you opt out of sales, you can't reasonably engage in targeted advertising or third-party segment creation, because, you know, one could say those are considered sales, and if they're your service provider, you can't engage in cross-context behavioral advertising anyway. So you're kind of stuck at that point, right? The sale is like the limiting factor, not to get too legalese. But arguably, if someone opted out of sales, you would be able to still target the user with advertising under the non-California state privacy laws, because the same restrictions under service providers and target advertising don't exist under those state laws. But you might think this is really confusing. You know, let's just treat them the same. Whatever the strictest outcome is, let's just do that. And that's what the national approach does. So instead of geolocating the user on the back end, finding they're in Colorado, sending that string out that's Colorado specific, having them ingested and treated accordingly, it's like, I have everything I need for all the states. I got all my notices of opt-out, so everyone knows what their rights are, and this person's opted out of sales. Treat them as if, you know, it's like the strictest outcome that you would have under the law. And it's actually in the MSPA, it says what is allowed and what's not allowed. And basically what it says is, okay, you can do what's allowed under California, right? So that would be the strictest outcome. So you can't do targeted advertising, you can't use the data for third-party segment creation, but you can use it for measurement and sales lift, brand lift, and stuff like that. It's just might be a cleaner way of doing things. You may lose out on some potential ad impressions, but you know, that's the trade-off, right? It's cleanliness, and, you know, it's easier to administrate, but you may lose a little more traffic. I think that might be palatable to some publishers and advertisers.
Just to add,
GPP.
Yeah, I was gonna just add to that, and you know, what I've heard is that, you know, there are just folks in the industry who just generally want the most conservative approach, like least complex, most conservative approach, right? And that was one of the reasons why the U.S. national approach was included as part of the MSPA, right, Sandeep?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You could take the route, and some do, of, it depends on, what state the user is in, and that's a valid approach, but this provides more I guess simpler implementation if you're taking the approach that, I'm just going to be conservative, I'm not going to do geolocation, I don't really, geolocation is not always accurate, or GIP lookup, so I'm just going to apply the strictest standard, which is an approach that we've been seeing.
Yeah, for sure. That's here at Wirewheel, right? As we're building out our support for the GPP, we really thought hard about, like, do we offer a national approach? Do we offer a state by state approach? And the answer for us is that we offer both, right? Because companies are going to want, both, and there are reasons why certain companies would feel comfortable, sticking to a particular state. Jeff, I'm sure you'd love to talk about the technical reasons why sometimes a state-by-state approach is challenging, just to identify, like, the geolocation and all of that.
Yeah, Sandeep mentioned the accuracy of geolocation. Sandeep, I actually wanted to ask you a question about something you had said. So from a legal perspective, residency versus physical location, do the laws take a point of view on that? So if I live in California, but I'm in Kansas.
Yeah, these are always the very theoretical questions that really came up a lot, like in 2018 with GDPR. If I'm flying over France, and but I have a cell phone that's from the US, so the law covers consumers of those states which are defined as residents. Now, practically speaking, though, there has to be some leeway here, right? Like, yeah, you might be on a laptop and are on VPN, and it says you're from one state and you're actually from another. I think, practically speaking, if this user, like, if you can GeoIP look up if they are in Colorado, whether they're in Colorado or not, or if they're not even if they're a resident or not, you're just gonna treat it as Colorado traffic. That's just this. I haven't really seen too many companies try to make that distinction, because it's impractical in on many levels.
And I couldn't agree more with what you had said about the applicability. I think that a company which is highly dependent on marketing to drive the traffic to their website is going to maybe look to a more complicated approach, like the MSPA approach. Whereas a company, a different type of company who drives traffic or gets business in a different way might go for a more secure, more kind of global approach, or a more national approach, rather. So.
So Sandeep, if folks are not ready to start sending or receiving GPP signals, can they still participate in the MSPA?
So you can still sign the MSPA, and so the way this breaks down is as follows. There are, of course, companies that are not ready yet to build or receive the signals, ingest them, act accordingly. Of course, right? There's a lot of signals, and there's a lot of work to be done in other realms as well under these laws, like your notices and stuff like that. For California, you have until July 1 for your honoring of the CPRA specific, California specific signals, let's say. Until then, you can use the US privacy string signal for California. The other ones, the agreement says that you shouldn't toggle these signals on until the effective date of the agreement. So Utah in December, Connecticut and Colorado in July. Of course, California is effective on January 1st, but not the CPRA changes to the CCPA are not enforceable until July. They say if you're not ready to honor, receive, build, whatever GPP signals for California, you have to do it by July 1, but you can rely on the US privacy string, which is used today under the LSPA, until then. But for Virginia, you would just not be able to process covered transactions under Virginia. So you couldn't set the signal to yes, but of course you can't build a signal yet, so that's not really that much of a concern. But you can sign up for it right now. You can't take advantage of the benefits of it really, except for California. And then by July, you want to make sure you can do all the other CPRA specific strings.
Yeah, and I wanted to just mention that to talk about the registration flow and process a little bit is that, like, as Sandeep was mentioning, there's this like key date of July 1st. So if you choose to participate in the MSPA, you can go ahead. It's open to register for participation or sign up today. And part of that registration flow, we one of the last steps is to actually indicate whether you have completed your GPP implementation yet. And so in the beginning, if you're planning on being an MSPA signatory, you actually can go ahead and do that today. And then you would leave that screen or that little box, it's a little checkbox unchecked. And as soon as you have completed your build, you'll go back into the registration portal to indicate that you have now completed your GPP build.
Yeah, and it's a good idea because, okay, so I mean, you can't build to GPP yet, maybe for certain states, and you're relying on California, US pricing for California, but you're still under the industry umbrella, right? It's got all the standard terms for all the different privacy laws. It's still very useful in that case. It cuts down on inefficiencies, and every law requires you to update your DPA, right? That's kind of built into the MSPA, so it's really useful in that case. You really gain a lot of efficiencies, and also being under the industry umbrella also has its own benefits, of course.
Absolutely. Sandeep, who should really be considering signing the MSPA?
Yeah, so I mean, this might sound like a cliche answer, but I would say, across the gamut, right? Starting from publishers, going to intermediate ad tech companies, and then advertisers, right? For publishers, it's useful because it still enables first party advertising, because the way it works, if you're not using like a signaling system, essentially is you go onto a site and you click opt out, and it just kind of shuts off the pixels from firing upon page load, and so the traffic is completely dropped. Which, for targeting, fine. You might think, okay, you have this user expectation, but there's other things besides targeting in the advertising ecosystem. Something that's really important is you may just be using pixels for measurements, right? Maybe you're advertising something on a social media platform. You just have their pixel for measurement purposes. Your ability to measure conversions or have the company measure conversions, you want to be able to do that for that consumer, even if they converted. So for publishers, it's important because if you're doing first party advertising on your platform, you can send signals out and receive signals for measurement purposes, and you might be able to send signals out for first party advertising if you're sending information out purely in the first party context for bidding. So for publishers, it's really important. For ad tech intermediaries, of course, you can have the chance at more impressions. You're probably doing measurement yourself, or brand lift and sales lift and matching, and that's super important for an ad tech intermediary. You can service both sides, right? If you're a DSP or you're an exchange. On the advertiser side, it's also really important. So, for example, you might be advertising on big publisher X and then have a pixel for measurement purposes. And if you have the signaling system, you can still use that measurement provider. You don't have to cut off or affect your measurement metrics. So you can just be more nuanced, right? You don't have to drop all traffic. You don't have to drop all pixels. You can still, do targeted advertising depending on the jurisdiction, depending on what choices you've provided. And you can still facilitate measurement and frequency capping, all the things that kind of all work together. So it's not just about targeting. There's other aspects to a digital advertising transaction or campaign, and you can be more nuanced about it. And still get more value and be able to measure your advertising campaigns.
Perfect. Marina, do you want to talk a little bit about, if someone isn't a signatory of the MSPA, can they still use the GPP? Is that, is that acceptable?
Yeah, so as it relates to the US state signals within the GPP, even if you're not a signatory to the MSPA, yes. I think I probably glossed over it, but I briefly showcased it when I walked through the example GPP string. First parties do have the option to designate whether a specific transaction is an MSPA covered transaction or not. So as a non-signatory, all of your transactions should be listed as non-MSPA covered, but you can still use the signal. But Sandeep sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier already, and I'm just going to say it again, is that you don't get the benefits of being part of this network, right? A part of the benefit of being an MSPA signatory and having sort of those contracts in place to fill those gaps. Like, you're going to have to do all of that on your own, which sounds like a lot of work to me, but I'm also not a lawyer, but you're a little bit on your own in terms of the agreements on details of the signal itself and how the signal is governed. So things like who's actually responsible for identifying the user's location, or I guess residency, and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the contract piece, which are called gap transactions in the agreement, that can't be overstated. I'm sure for all the lawyers that are on the call, all the DPAs you're getting, and then you're saying, well, no, use our DPA, and it's like, do we wait for renewal for this DPA? And, quibbling over the language, having this standardized language which complies with the law is really useful.
Perfect. We did get a question, Rowena, and they asked, what % of the industry use MSPA and separately the GPP? Do you have any sense of that?
I don't have numbers handy. What I can say is that the MSPA, we just opened registration for the MSPA alone recently in December, the 1st of December, actually. And the GPP and the US state signals were just finalized a few weeks ago. So it's still sort of early. And so unfortunately, I don't have specific numbers that I can share at this time.
Yeah, no worries. It is early, and I've been sitting on several roundtables of, there's lots of participants who are committed early on to implementing it, and I'd say that there's really heavy interest in adoption of it, right? So I don't know that we have an exact polling yet, but I think that it's going to take off and it's going to be a really big hit. So folks should definitely be paying attention to it. So Rowena, I think 2 last questions just to think about. How do we keep the GPP evolved, right, as new state laws come out, and how are we going to keep it updated? And then sort of what's next for the GPP?
Yeah, and this goes back to the flexibility of the GPP. What's really nice is that it might feel like a lot of overhead and a lot of work to implement today. You sort of do it once, and then the flexibility will allow for us as an industry to be able to comply with any new state privacy laws that may require consent signaling much more readily. That's not to say there's no work and it's going to be super easy, and that's definitely not the case. But by implementing now, the flexibility of the GPP will make that process a lot easier. And the whole idea behind it is to reduce the technical burden on the industry. And to your second question of what is the future of the GPP look like? Well, I believe there are 4 other potential state privacy bills and coming in who knows what year. And so, we'll be paying close attention to that. But again, it's the GPP is a global privacy platform. And so we do have the aspiration and do plan to sort of continue to support other global regional privacy strings in the future.
Perfect. I think that kind of closes out all the major points that I had. Rowena, Sandeep, any last thoughts or anything you want to add?
No, I put in the chat for the lawyers on the call. If you want to check out the MSPA itself, I put a link to where you can download it. It's 36 pages. It used to be like 76, 78 pages, and we got it down to a manageable length. I think it's going to be really useful because it's dynamic, and I think that these laws require dynamic solutions rather than, you know, just like a one size fits all approach. And it's flexible, and you know, having those the contract language in place really helps to shore up situations where it's, I'm not gonna say impossible to have contracts in place with them, but very difficult, such as, you know, if you're pinging like a third-party advertiser ad server, and the MSPA covers that. So it's really well thought out, and it sets forth all the different activities that you can and can't do, and covers everything from measurement, targeted advertising, viewability, negative targeting. I mean, it really is very, very in-depth and very comprehensive. So hope that this piques your interest and you check it out.
Thanks, Sandeep. Rowena, there was one last question that came in, and it's, is the GPP and the US privacy string the same thing?
That is a great question. So no, I think because everyone has compliance with these new US state privacy laws top of mind currently, that they're sort of using them interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same thing. I guess another way that I can explain of how you can think about what the GPP is that it's sort of a wrapper. So it sits above any other regional signals. And what the GPP does is it allows for the transport of US state-specific strings. Hopefully that helps clarify it.
Yep, thank you, Rowena. Well, great. Thank you so much, both Rowena and Sandeep and Jeff, for joining us today. Hopefully, folks, this was very enlightening for me. I'm sure our guests possibly also learned a lot. I think this closes out the last of today for Spokes. Is that right, Anne?
Nope.
Oh, that's right.
We have a demo of our UPCP platform coming up next, and then we'll have an armchair discussion with Cam Curry and Justin, and then we'll close it out with our 2023 predictions.
I'm completely wrong, right? So we've got lots more content. Hope you guys stick around. Enjoy the rest of Spokes. We're so glad you're all here with us, and thanks to everyone today.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.